Welcome to Inca Podcast, Play a Podcast, Aside Events. We are off this week for the holiday. We will be back with a new episode next week, but I wanted to get on here and just kind of talk about a thing I have been thinking about that didn't graduate into a full episode. It didn't necessitate a full episode because I don't know how much more we'll talk about this or what there is to talk about. But I had this thought when Whispers in the Well came out with the card Malicious, Mean, and Scary. For those who don't know, it's a 3-cost song that puts a damage counter on all of your opponent's characters. Okay. And when the card was previewed, people were talking about how it gets around resist. And it does that because putting damage counters is not the same thing as dealing damage. And I thought that that was really interesting because there's no real reason why that should actually be the case. That is the rule because it is the rule. To be clear, I'm not complaining about this, but I think it's really interesting that they have opened design space up purely based off of rulings and not based off of like the rules, if that makes any sense. So like there's a rule that says that you can only ink one card a turn. So then that opens design space to allow you to circumvent that rule. But rulings, it feels like there's a difference in my mind. I differentiate them because putting a damage counter on something is effectively the same thing as damaging something. And the only reason why it's not the same thing is because there was a ruling that says that it's not the same thing. But because that exists, it allows design space to open up where Emerald gets damaging cards without technically, within the rules definition, damaging characters. So I think another example of this is moving damage. Moving damage also removes damage because you have to remove it from one character to put it onto another. And that very well could have been ruled the other way. If you are thinking in terms of technicality, you know, the physical act, yes, you are removing to put it onto another character, but you could definitely see a world that exists where because it doesn't say remove, it doesn't count as removing, it counts as moving. And so that has opened up a different avenue for Amethyst cards to interact with any other card that cares about healing. But then that brings up a different point, which is if moving damage counters counts as removing damage counters, then doesn't that make it just a strictly better version of healing? I get that they're in different colors, and that's completely fine. That's a completely valid argument. But it feels as though pure healing cards have to reach a higher threshold of viability because they don't do anything else on their own, while moving damage counters inherently does what healing does and also affects your opponent's board. Another example is that you have to follow the order on cards, right? So if a card has multiple effects, you have to follow those effects in the order that they're printed. So, for example, this is the time where he pulls up an example. Helping Hand, a 1-cost action, chosen character gains support this turn, draw a card, plays differently than Hypnotic Strength, which is draw a card, chosen character gains +2 challenger. Because of the way that the rules work, you have to follow the order on these cards. They effectively do very similar things, right? The card itself cycles, and you get some benefit to one of your characters. However, with Hypnotic Strength, you don't choose the character until after you've drawn the card. But with Helping Hand, you have to choose your character first before gaining the information from the card that you've just drawn. I could totally see a universe where you are permitted to choose any order that you'd like. But because of the way that the rules work, that's not the universe that we live in. And so we have to go by the order on the card. And I think it's interesting. I'm not saying it's bad, but I think it's interesting. And it does open up different design space, because you can imagine a different card, not named Hypnotic Strength, that reverses those two things. 98% of the time, it's going to be the exact same card. But 2% of the time, in certain situations, it's going to matter that you have to choose your character first before you get the information. Those are just a few of the examples that I've thought of at this point. I'm sure that I will find more examples as I continue to play. I tend to fixate on these types of things. I like digging into game design to see how these sorts of things tick, especially when there are so many other card games. I like seeing kind of the similarities and the differences. If you have any examples of design from rules, please drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear about them. I'm constantly trying to think of things like this. Anyway, we will be back next week with a brand new episode. Thank you for listening to Aside Events.